Well, those were all amazing presentations and definitely got through many of our questions that we were already going to ask, because you are a group of thorough and well-prepared Black women. But maybe we'll start with this focus and celebration of Black women, particularly in Black museums. It's not an accident that we're all Black women participating in this today. And so there's been a lot of talk of honoring those that came before us. And we'd love if you all might speak anecdotally about your experience being nurtured by or mentored by or just reading the scholarship of Black women and how that's informed your relationship with conceiving of your work within these institutions that you're at today.
Me to start?
Sure.
Okay. So I think it was 2 weeks ago exactly that Carrie Mae Weems came and had a seminar with her, and it gave me the opportunity to reflect on the fact that I met her when I think I was 22 years old. And in my master's program, it was my very first public presentation at a conference. She was there, and so was Deborah Willis. And each of them were already, in my mind, amazing, famous women who were curator and artist who were just really thrilled to see another Black woman on the scene coming. And so over the course of my now 30-something year career, to have people like them who've made great work and who've made great art and made great scholarship and made great exhibitions, among other things, to catch up with them and to see how our careers have grown and just gone off in different and great places is really special. I do want to say, though, that, I also wouldn't be here if I hadn't been mentored by white people. Mm-hmm. And so I will just remind us of that, too. Mm-hmm. And in that respect, I want to acknowledge my advisor, Wanda Korn, who at Stanford created something that she called, the Americanist program at Stanford, and that was the program that I got my PhD in. And when I was in school, all I wanted to do was be my advisor and to create stuff like she created stuff. And so when I got to UT, I just tried to do what my advisor did, which was to build stuff and to make stuff and to put it together so that other people could have good, enriching experiences.
So there's 2 Black women, I think, that form the nodes of my practice, and they do actually intersect in a very kind of touching, beautiful way. But one is my mom, and she was a person who was always making and building and doing in our home, and really saw the beautiful home and a place that is open and hospitable for all. It became sort of the central place for our family, and my mom has 7 sisters. And the fact that my parents built this together and that my mom really offered this sense of generosity, it was really the first place that I understood what it meant to make space for beauty and care and gathering. Mm-hmm. And that being a place where you can break generational curses, and that you can also imagine a new future that perhaps was previously unimaginable. So that's really core. And then sort of later, my mom transforms my practice. I'm a student at Yale, and I spend a year of my life writing this thesis. I'm only one of 2 students in the department who are given the opportunity to write a year-long thesis. It follows the history of wax from anatomical models to the present day and its forms of looking at contemporary art. And I give it to my mom, and she says, "Cammie, I don't understand this, but I know it's good." And I told myself at that moment I would never, ever write something again that my mom couldn't understand. Mm-hmm. And that became the grounding of my whole practice. And that's how I think about museums now in terms of this intersection that we talked about of Black life and daily life and thinking through the questions in daily life that we can all experience, through the perspective of contemporary art or scholarship, but really grounding it in lived experience as an entry point for understanding and for navigating difficult questions. And the other is Kelly Jones, who many of you know is an incredible scholar, and she was a teacher of mine. But it was going to her Now Dig This exhibition when it was at the Hammer, and I actually went with my mom and one of my aunts. And Kelly's show looked at specifically at Black Los Angeles, 1960s to 1980s. And it looked at the areas where my parents grew up. So my mom was going through the exhibition, pointing out her house underneath the Watts Towers, realizing that her ceramic teacher in high school was actually this famous artist, and she had no idea. So it was this beautiful moment of recognizing that I was part of a lineage, a really important lineage, and that I needed to be in service to that lineage. So that brought me away from New Orleans, where I was living, another place where people had a deep sense of belonging and collectivity and history, and I moved back to Los Angeles, my hometown, and to be in deep service to my community at CAM. So it does feel very much like a homecoming, and these two women, know how much they've impacted my life, but it's shown itself to me in the retrospect in ways that I didn't understand as it was unfolding.
No, I think that's beautiful. I'll also just give a quick shout out to my mom, because I think, just the basis of the work that I do is the person that I am, and so I have a hard time separating those. But my mom's African American and my dad is Black Panamanian, and I never grew up confused about that. I never grew up feeling like I couldn't be both of these things at the same time. Like, I recognized other people's confusion, but I think I just grew up in such a way that my parents were like, that's their problem, it's not your problem. Like how you identify and how you define yourself, that's what it is. Nobody else can do that for you. And so I think that's the energy that I've always brought into museum spaces, and I think that it has been important for me to say that out loud to other people so they know it's fine for however they want to identify is also fine, and so when you study museums, so many of them are white museums, right? And so thinking about, Blackness is the diversity there. And so it's been just such a beautiful way for me to have a career with Blackness as diversity and not having to homogenize anything in that way. But one of the people who really did get me into museums, like as a career, is Michelle Wilkinson, who's actually my colleague now at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But I met her, we were both Mellon Fellows, different generations. So when I met her, I was finishing graduate school, and I knew I didn't want to be a professor, but I just wasn't really sure exactly what I wanted to do. And that's not what your parents want to hear when you're finishing graduate school. And so I'd always loved museums, but I had not really, and I went to graduate school in Washington, D.C., so I was at the Smithsonian all the time because it's free, but I was like, I don't know how to enter this field. Like, I just really didn't know. And so we were at this Mellon event in Baltimore, and I'm an introvert. I tell Michelle every day, I was like, thank you for being an extrovert. Thank you for coming up to me at this cocktail table and just start talking to me. Because she talked to me, she was at the time working at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum in Baltimore, but talked about leaving academia because she wanted to know if this was the career field that she wanted to get into. So she left teaching, I believe she was teaching at Emory at the time, took an internship at the Studio Museum, and the rest is history. So I was hired by the Smithsonian in 2013 at Anacostia. She was hired in 2014 at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and in 2017 we became colleagues. And she really has mentored me, through what does it look like to work at a Black museum? What does it look like for this kind of work that you want to do? Because her degree, I believe, is in Black and Puerto Rican studies. And so before I got to the museum, she was doing a lot of that Latinx-focused work. And so it's always nice to know that, you're bringing something and adding to what's already there, as opposed to convincing people that this is something that should be here. And I think just institutionally, too, Carmen Ramos has been just a really important and wonderful mentor to me. And to your point, Dr. Smith, about one, non-Black women. So because I do Latinidad, there's so few Black women in that space. And I have always appreciated when non-Black Latinas champion the work that Black Latinas are doing. And so Teresita Fernandez has been one of those people for me, just like a light, and always shining her light because she has such a spotlight on the work that other people are. And as far as men go, Black men, Lonnie Bunch has been a real generous mentor I think he's well known for his scholarship and his leadership, but I don't think that he gets enough credit for how he mentors next generations of Black museum professionals.
Thank you all for speaking so candidly about that. I appreciate it.
It really leads in well to our next question. As Delphine and I have said at this point a lot of times, our formative experiences working at Black museums really helped us figure out that we wanted to build careers in museums, and then we each have, incredible mentors, especially Black women, who've helped us kind of build our careers. So I'd like to know from each of you kind of how you envision your own role in mentoring and helping support the next generation of Black museum professionals and Black scholars.
I can start quickly and say, one small but time-consuming way is having open social media accounts, because I didn't know who to go to when I had questions about the field. And so I do appreciate, that people do reach out just to know if this is something that they want to do, or to find out what actually a curator does, or what does that look like, or what your everyday looks like. And so just that there are ways that people can contact with questions. I would say the other soapbox that I stand on often is money. We rely heavily on contractors at the Smithsonian. And I was so proud to be able to champion for a staff position, right? So I had contract curatorial assistants before. There was some funding available. And I was just like, we have choices. We can have a staff position, right? If we're serious about building this pipeline, then we need to give people opportunities to actually do this as work, right? Not as one of 5 jobs that they have to juggle to figure it out. So one, just being able to provide actual contracts when there are contracts, staff positions when we can do staff positions, but really just trying to share opportunities, right? There are few of us. There are a lot of ways in which we're invited into spaces. And when we can use our invitations to invite other people, it just, I think, builds that larger foundation for the work that we want to continue.
Yeah, I would also just say making space to be in one-on-one conversation. So anytime a young person reaches out to me, I try to make time for that conversation, even if that means saying no to a lot of other conversations, which I do say no to a lot of other conversations, but I don't say no to young people. Because I feel like I didn't chart my course in the museum field. I charted my course doing a million other things when I was just really listening to myself. So I think that's one of the things I really try to bring to conversations that I have with young folks, just how important it is to begin to orient yourself to your own internal compass, right? To listen to yourself, to follow the curiosities, the things that you want to learn, because ultimately my career was built on following what I wanted to learn at any given time. So that's something that's been really important to me, but really trying to figure out how I can find a more structured space for that, because I didn't have a lot of structured space when I was coming up, and I would love to find a way to be part of more structured space for that. And you are the structured space.
Yeah, right.
You live that.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah, I mean, I'm all mentor all the time, and it's something that I take a lot of pride in. Just professionalizing people and creating opportunities for them, and finding the money for people to get to do the big thinking, visioning, and then putting it into real life things that they want to do. And I think that's partially because I have been fortunate enough to have been the recipient, the beneficiary of people thinking that I could do something that still felt a little bit beyond my reach, but putting me in a position to mentor me so that I could go and do bigger things. And I thank Ted for that, who seems to have gone. Hearkening back to the person who's on this building, if President Powers hadn't decided, let's build a Black museum, we wouldn't be where we are today here at AGBS. At any rate, I feel like these are things that kind of reach experience. I try to put my students and my colleagues in the positions to do that.
Thank you. I'm wondering if I should go extremely logistical, but I think money has come up, so maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But also, these are three, you all represent very distinctive Black museums, Black institutions with particular stakeholders. And I guess part of my question is a lot of mainstream white museums are held and constricted by their board. So I'm hoping you all might be able to talk a little bit about those sort of unseen stakeholders that the museum public doesn't necessarily always know has such force within decision making. And I think it looks a lot different for each of you, but if you could talk a little bit about the shift in board members, or maybe there is no board at all, but like who you have to speak to internally when you're imagining the future of your museum spaces, if that makes sense.
CAM is a state-supported museum, so our board is appointed by the Governor of California, and I'm in deep conversation with them, but they don't have deep influence over how the museum is shaped. I find the most difficult conversations I have about the future of the museum are with the government and what we call control agencies, so Department of Finance, Department of General Services. That actually determines how taxpayers' dollars are spent and how. So those are the most difficult and challenging conversations where I actually feel like I'm doing the most transformative and revolutionary work, and nobody knows it's happening. But I am rewriting legislation. I am fighting policy. I am, in this space of questioning and learning all the time around California's bureaucracy that is really laying the groundwork, what I hope for the future success of directors to come after me. And it's work for a lot of reasons that the directors before me weren't able to do. So I recognize that privileged position that I am to be able to do that work and to speak some of those languages that allow me to do that work. So that's really where I'm focused right now, is on that not so sexy behind the scenes stuff that can actually transform the future of the museum.
But you also recently started a foundation, right?
We are in the process of starting a foundation right now, and that's part of the work. I'm having to rewrite the legislation from 1977 to give us the authority to do that. But we have been working with nonprofit partners in the last few years to open up the space to work with donors, particularly large foundations across the country. So opening up new avenues to expand our finances in order to be the ambitious institution that we can be.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say similarly, I work for federally funded institutions, and I think we don't answer to our board in that kind of way, but we answer to the public. And I think what I have learned, perhaps over like the past 5 years especially, is that people very much feel like the Smithsonian is their museum. And so when you have a public email address, you hear directly from random people about how they feel about anything that they might think is even related to something that you maybe perhaps one day could be or were associated with. So for some people, the Smithsonian is one place, as opposed to 21 different museums, 9 research centers, a zoo, all of these places. And so what I think where I am is figuring out what is my responsibility and what just isn't, and where I need to be careful for the longevity of the work and where I don't have to be. And so I think it's less about boards and stakeholders, or really, and just more about me figuring out, like, how does this work look best and how can I best position myself so that it continues, right? As opposed to wanting to always just be a punch in the face and then have the funding dry up. So I think that's more my dilemma.
So we're sponsored by the university. We do have donors, and it's our goal to cultivate more so that we can be self-sustaining, so that we are not kind of subject to the whims of the university or to the state. I think all of us have those kinds of goals.
Yeah, I think it's rare that you would have 3 folks in our position share that.
Yeah. I guess the one thing in your question, though, that I wanted to, nuance, though, is all of my museum experience has been in large white institutions. So prior to starting Art Galleries of Black Studies, I worked at the Met, the St. Louis Art Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago. And so in creating Art Galleries of Black Studies, I didn't know I was creating a Black museum. I was creating exhibition spaces, collecting spaces that were in Art Galleries of Black Studies that were in Black Studies, that had all of the kind of component parts of critical thinking, critical art practices, historicizing, contextualizing that you find in Black Studies and related to Black people and Black makers. But it's really only been in the last couple of years that I've realized, oh, this is a Black museum. And that's a really different and interesting thing, especially to be a kind of ethnically specific museum inside of a PWI.
Yeah.
And I think you at the Smithsonian have a similar
Absolutely.
Experience, and maybe you feel like you do, maybe you feel like you don't. But I feel like there's a nuancing there of being ethnically specific in a PWI that makes for a particular experience that we have.
Yeah.
So we're going to close our part of the Q&A and open it up to audience questions, but we have a bit of a sentimental thing that we'd like to share at the end. Delphine, can you go to our slide? So in 2009, Delphine and I took several of our uncles, along with our parents and our youngest sister, shout out to Rosette, who's watching this remotely, the third Sim sister, to the California African American Museum. Everybody immediately felt comfortable, and these are folks that don't always go to museums. And we were able to kind of talk about some of the painful parts of Black history while also celebrating Black art and Black cultural contributions as a family. Similarly, for our dad's 60th birthday, we took him to the NMAAHC, where he immersed himself in the sports section. I thought we were never going to get him to leave. He loved the musical Crossroads very much, and later we posed for that picture up there that he then got put on a T-shirt that's in front of the museum, and he wears that T-shirt a lot.
I love it.
And then finally, some of my fondest memories from attending UT remain at the Art Galleries at Black Studies, where I remember seeing Dawood Bey get this like thunderous applause that was just so special. And later, Delphine and I posed for a museum mirror selfie, which is what we do in a Genevieve Jennard show installation. And then I've also just gotten to witness Charisse model, incredible leadership and vision that I hope that I can someday emulate. And so we just wanted to finish our section of the Q&A by thanking all three of you for working at institutions and contributing to spaces that have held so much personal importance for the two of us and for our whole family. So thank you. So I'd like to start the Q&A with a question we received online before we even all came together. And no pressure, I don't know who would like to kind of try to answer this question, but it reads, do African American and African diasporic studies museums and art galleries ever collaborate with artists, scholars, art organizations, and cultural institutions located on the African continent? If they do, how, and if not, why? So if anybody wants to kind of tackle that one, we'd love to hear it.
I can say really briefly, I know that the museum does. It's not the work that I specifically do. So if whoever asked that question is watching, definitely look into our Center for the Study of Global Slavery. The Slave Rex projects that they do is the continent of Africa and also in the Caribbean and the United States. And I know that our Office of Strategic Partnerships at the National Museum of African American History and Culture works really closely with cultural organizations, museums, and museum professionals on the continent of Africa. So I don't have all of the details about what it is, the work that they do, but I know that the museum has a long-standing relationship with multiple institutions on the continent.
Thank you.
We don't. We haven't yet. We, in Black Studies, though, do offer study abroad and domestic programs that send people to the continent or to Brazil or Nicaragua or other places like that. But yeah, not art museums on the continent.
Well, maybe that's something that we can think about for future iterations of this initiative, something where we kind of focus more on people who are working within Black museum spaces in the U.S., but also thinking about the continent of Africa. So thank you for that question.
Can I just say one other thing? Just thinking about that in the reverse, we also have a National Museum of African Art that I know does work with diasporic communities outside of the continent, right? So just thinking about that relationship both ways, it does work in that way as well.
And I just wanted to add also, I think Koyo Kuo, who is a museum director in South Africa, does have a strong relationship with a number of Black institutions in the U.S. And is a really great model for Black museums being in dialogue with museum practice specifically out of South Africa, but also supporting artists on the continent.
Let me just nuance what I said. We have partnered with arts organizations in the Caribbean, and Shown Work had staff go back and forth between here and there. And we've also hosted curators from that organization at UT. And so it's not that continent, but it's not this.
It's not just domestic.
Yeah, it's just not North America or United States. Yeah.
Do we have any questions from audience members that we can answer? Yes, Ariel.
Well, this question isn't from me, it's from our virtual attendees. Thank you. This question is not from me, but from our virtual attendees. This one is from Anonymous, and it's for Cameron. And the question is, what's meant by legibility in the 4 pillars?
Legibility, the demands that Black culture and Black being be readable and accessible to whiteness, that it be framed in a way that whiteness can understand, is what legibility means in that context. That we have to be explaining ourselves to others outside of our culture in order to be justified or validated.
Yes.
My question is for Ariana. I am curious to know about your position in working with the scheduled to be the U.S. Latinos Museum. I'm curious if you'll be working with them as a partner. Also, any opinions on the museum?
I think the museum will be great. That is my official position. But I do believe that. So we are separate, and I can say in this context, especially, like, I love working at Black museums. That's not a Black museum. So that's something always to think about, and that's one of the reasons why I did take the opportunity, because I get asked this a lot if I'll move over, or like what happens with that relationship. And so I love how it feels when I go to work every day. And I don't know, because I've only worked for the past decade, I've worked in Black museums, I don't know how it feels to work in a different kind of space, or whether or not I want to. But the National Museum of the American Latino, so the short of a long history is that in 1994, there was a report called Willful Neglect that the Smithsonian commissioned to find out, what is the state of Latinos at this institution. It was called Willful Neglect, so you can imagine what it said. And then in 1997, a Smithsonian Latino Center was created. In 2010 was the first Latino Curatorial Initiative hire. 2013 was my cohort. And so what was the Smithsonian Latino Center, which was not a collecting institution, it was more of a programmatic center that worked throughout the institution and also was the source of Latino Initiatives pool and Latino Initiatives funding. So those federal appropriations that were slated for Latinidad specifically went through the Latino Center. And so that center is now the National Museum of the American Latino. And so it has gone from a non-collecting, more programmatic center to being a museum. And so there will be, for anyone who's looking for, there will be staffing, right? Because they didn't have curators, they didn't have a collection, so they need to build all of those things. So I think all of us who have been hired in the Latino Curatorial Initiative, so it's over 10 of us at this point. We constantly have worked together over this past decade, and we will continue to advise and give our areas of expertise. But I think the benefit of this National Museum of the American Latino is that there are Latinx scholars who work at very different kinds of museums in the same institution to guide, right, what this multidisciplinary museum can look like, learn from the mistakes that we've made, creating Latinidad in our own spaces, and what that might look like in telling a national story. So I don't, in particular, have any formal connection there, but just as we're colleagues and we're part of the same museum system, I think they will benefit from the fact that there is this longer standing presence of Latinidad in the Smithsonian in very intentional ways in archives and history museums and art museums, in our traveling exhibition services that will feed the expertise that they will need to grow.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, this kind of follows up from the Carrie Mae Weems seminar we had a couple of weeks ago about where the men are in this conversation, and kind of thinking about that slide of how many museum directors are white. I would say also the majority of them are also white men. And so it seems as though, especially if you look at the art history program at UT and all of the people studying, Black art or art of the diaspora, they're women, and you guys are all women. Do you find that you have an extra layer of discrimination being women in the museums as well as being Black? I mean, because do you have lots of young male colleagues kind of coming up and growing, or is this largely a woman, or has been a woman? I don't know how to say it, but there's something there, and I'd be curious on your thoughts.
I think there are a dearth of Black men in the field. And I think you two might be able to speak more deeply to why that is, but I am curious about the future of the field and how we encourage young Black men who have an interest to be in the space. Because we see a lot of Black men come to us as artists or as programmatic partners, but not as drivers of the field in terms of art history or directorships.
No, I would agree. I mean, I showed just data about race. The reports also do give gender breakdowns. And I can't say that I looked at it really specifically, but I did. I spoke at TED Women about museums and women's representation, and so that was in 2018, and that's the last time I really looked at that data. That there are a lot of women in the museum field, right? But to your point, fewer women in positions of leadership, and so that's the separation. That there are a lot of women here in the field, fewer museum directors, fewer board chairs, fewer board members, and so that had, at least the last time I looked at the data, that was really the gendered breakdown.
I mean, do you find that you're fighting kind of? Do you find that you're finding like on two fronts, in terms of it's a Black museum, and then also you are a woman in a largely white male-led field?
Yeah, I don't think Black museums are exempt from social power structures. Right? So I'm a Black woman fighting that every day in and outside of my workplace.
Can anyone address what kinds of systems that are in place to cultivate more male presence in the field? What kind of institutional, what type of systems at other points within the culture?
I don't think I know of.
Try.
Okay, yeah.
There is a curator at MoMA named Achille Tomasino, and I think he was at MoMA, now he's at the Met in contemporary art, and he is really invested in he started, I believe it's a nonprofit, to take high school age kids specifically to introduce them to the museum field as a potential career. And I think we're seeing more focus on high schoolers understanding that art history and museum practice is a possible career choice. And then I would also add to that a potential problem and promise of an institution overseen by Cheryl Finley, coming out of Spelman, which is another focus on the potential for a curatorial career, but obviously being housed at Spelman, it has a particular demographic that it's working with explicitly. But I think in the United States, there is sort of a loss of interest in the arts in general that we don't see in the same way globally. And I think there's broadly some work that needs to be done around that, right?
Yeah, and I can speak. So I work at a regional museum. It's not a Black museum right now. But one of the things that we're working on it. One of the things that I'm doing, and this is just what I'm doing, this is not based on anyone else's kind of vision, but I'm sure that there's lots of people who can speak to this more than I can, is we're partnering with Black fraternities to get more younger Black men into the museum, and so and giving them private tours and offering mentorship opportunities so that at least we're kind of trying to target these populations that maybe don't always come to museums, and also doing it in an environment where there's like this community sense. And so that's how I'm trying to work on that, but obviously that's a very small kind of drop in the bucket, but I think, it's something that other museums might be working on as well.
Just to add to that, it's not anything formal that I know of, but I do know that generally museums are trying to be more transparent about what museums careers look like beyond just curatorial, right? And so thinking about the presence of Black men in other places like communications, maybe education, not so much, that's still pretty female dominated, right? But there are all of these different kinds of museum spaces, and I think particularly once we get into like the digital realms, I tend to see more Black men in those spaces than I do maybe in curatorial or education. So right, just also thinking about like all of the different things that go into running a museum and museum careers. And so sometimes because curatorial and collections are kind of the more public facing, we don't see in the behind the scenes work where men and Black men specifically might be.
And I think also in general, there's an emergence of more pipeline-oriented work in the field. So I think it might be too early to tell how successful that work has been.
Yeah.
And we may see a different shift in the field 5-10 years as people from that pipeline either stay in the field or leave.
I feel like there's another way to answer this question, and that's maybe from a cultural point of view. And I think about how Art Galleries of Black Studies has a problem in its own institution, and that is to say that Black Studies doesn't use its own art galleries as well as it should. And that then, in our experience, Black people don't use AGBS like they should or like we might like them to be. And so I think in some ways there's just not a full appreciation of art in the larger Black community as much as we might like. And so I think perhaps history museums are more or better attended by Black communities, but art still has an uphill battle where Black people are concerned. And
I agree.
I think it's something that we should, it's an elephant in the room that we should address. And so if you've got the problem with Black people in art, and then you've also got the problem of Black men in art, because I think art has a particular association or sets of associations.
So would you guys say it's an issue of value?
I think it's an issue of access.
I think it's access, and I think it's white supremacy. I think that museums have been cultivated to be exclusive places that are not comfortable, and so people don't want to go. Don't touch this. Don't walk this way. Walk with your hands behind your back. You go, and the guards tell you what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to behave. And so they're not spaces that we and that many people want to go to, and not even just Black people. And so I feel like that's at least part of the problem.
Yeah, it's a real conundrum when I think about like what CAM looks like, because on any given night, if we have an open galleries event or a dance party or a talk, there's thousands upon black people there, right? And there's tons of black men there. So it's not that there's not room in the museum for them, but I don't know why that's not translating to room in the field for them. Or it's just interesting, even when I look at our job applications, So it's an interesting question that I want to think on more. And it's come up before.
I think we have time for one more, and then we're going to have to close. So, you want to go? Yes.
Thank you. Also, I wanted to shout out Ade Omatosho because he was a graduate of UT, and I remember working with him at the galleries, and now he's the assistant curator at the Dallas Museum of Art. So, shout out to Ade. My question involves like organizational structure and thinking about, I understand how the purpose of your museums and the positions of community building and the ethics of care, but how has that translated into the way that the museum operates with like positions and just like your organizational chart and the flow of power? What does that look like to you all, and has it shifted, or does it shift within Black museum spaces? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that's a super interesting and useful question to think through. And in the case of AGBS, we have a kind of radically horizontal structure, which I think is more about the politics of Black studies than its original structure, which was more hierarchical. And partially it's more horizontal now as a function of we're a small museum and everybody has to do everything. And so in the most recent, and I'm saying this in the last couple of years, job descriptions that were written, it was, this is all hands on deck. This is, an environment where you lend a hand. It's everybody does everything. So there's an understanding that it's going to be more of this and less more of this. And I think in our first iteration, it was more hierarchical, not because that's what I was interested in replicating, but having come from larger institutions that have dedicated staffs that do super dedicated things, right? Conservation, publications. And you know this well. I can imagine that CAM has a more horizontal, everybody does everything approach, I'm imagining. Yeah, okay, then no. But having said that, so, coming from a St. Louis Art Museum or an Art Institute of Chicago where people only do their niche thing, that was what was created in the first iteration.
I'm sorry. I would say we're very all hands on deck in the sense that we're small but mighty. We're 15 people right now, and even at our largest, we only have position authority to be 19 people. Wow. So I'm working on that. But we are also quite specified and hierarchical in the sense that we're a state museum, so we're all civil servants. So just like the person who works at the DMV or the Metro, we have really deep specificities about what people can and cannot do, and those are part of years of collective bargaining. We're all unionized, right? So like in some ways there's incredible labor protections, but there's also a lot less flexibility, and that's one of the things that I think when I put on my sort of administrator hat, long-term sustainability, what are we building towards? Some of these are very, very thorny problems where there's some win and there's some lose to the way that we're structured. And I think it's something that we're going to be working on for some time, but it does mean, our minimum wage is higher than the minimum wage. There's nobody at the museum who makes less than $21 an hour, even at the front of house. Like I said, we're governed by collective bargaining. Most folks are unionized, or even if they're exempt, they're following union leads because it's part of a strong negotiation structure of a government. So it is really interesting in that sense, but I think one of the places that we're really trying to flex right now in terms of sort of equity and structure is about what it means to move money and to whom we're able to move it. So we pay all artists who work with us. We're constantly thinking about what the best structure is for that, how, especially because we are using taxpayer dollars, sort of this idea of creative and compliant, how do we deliver on our mission at the highest level and our values, while also recognizing that we work in a system that wasn't designed for us. It wasn't designed for artists, it wasn't designed for a Black museum, so how do we make sense of that? But also looking to what are our partners, and I said I wouldn't share this, but I'm going to share it, and I'll share it with some vagueness because it's not yet public, but we've been working on a residency program to really think about what does it mean to demonstrate methodologies for supporting artists more holistically, for Black artists to bring difficult, challenging, time-intensive projects into the world. And that is going to be launched in a residency that we're going to be announcing soon. And part of that was also putting in a lot of money for production outcomes, for travel, for research, but also putting in a living wage stipend. So each artist who participates in that program gets $65,000 a year to do their work. So that's like, your art is your job, and we respect that that's your job. So really trying to think of what are some of those structures that we can introduce. Like, if white museums are centering Black artists, what are we doing to support them? What are we doing to put forward those models that, like, hopefully it won't take people 40 years to catch up, but that's where we have to be. When I talk about that idea of being as visionary in 2023 as they were in 1977, we've got to constantly be thinking about what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I work for a federal institution. It's pretty hierarchical, but there was, I mean, to your point though, Sharice, there was a real difference in working at a community museum, working at Anacostia, and then going over to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And part of it was a loss of freedom. That when I was at Anacostia, it wasn't all hands on deck, right? I think in all of our job descriptions, there's like other duties as decided, but there's limits to that. But when you work at a small museum, you have to do more than just what your job title might suggest that you are responsible for. And because that was my entrance, I enjoyed that. So moving over to African American History and Culture, where our OCA department is larger, our curatorial department is much larger than the whole staff at Anacostia. So I came in like, I want to do these public programs, next week. And if they could, they would have just laughed in my face, because that's just not how things work, And so a lot of the things that I was able to do as a curator at a community museum were no longer my responsibility when I moved over to be a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And so really just figuring out, like, where are the wins in that, right? So like I said, I had the time. I was not working on an exhibition. The museum was open. I wasn't responsible for 500 other things. I had the time and mental capacity to create a curatorial framework, right? Because I didn't have all of these other things that I was expected to do that weren't necessarily my job. And so I think that there are pros and cons of it, but we are absolutely hierarchical, and different positions have different kinds of freedoms. I am aware of the freedom that I have as a curator at the Smithsonian to do things that non-curators can't necessarily just do. So there's like a horizontal and a vertical hierarchy there, but we are Black museums within a predominantly white system in an institution that's like 176 years old, It's hierarchical.
Should I?
Yes, please. Thank you for your questions.
So thanks to all of you for coming, and thank you to Gayla Sims, Delphine Sims, Ariel Evans. The Art Galleries of Black Studies staff, Joy, Alex, Zane. Presenters, Ariana, Cameron, Ted, Philip, and Rachel. As well as to the late staff who are pushing this out into the world and hopefully recording this for us. So we have a reception over at Christian Green Gallery, which is about a block away. We've got coffee, we've got desserts, and we really want you to come back out and see our art. And thank you again for coming.